In the middle of a white wasteland, a newborn's cry pierces the silence. Snow drifts down in thick, unforgiving sheets. The mother, wrapped in stitched furs, clutches the tiny infant to her chest, her body trembling not from the cold but from fear. Around her, the clan stirs with quiet urgency. Fire must be lit, milk must flow, shelter must hold. Because in the Ice Age, birth was not a beginning, it was a gamble, and every breath a baby took was an act of defiance against extinction. But somehow we made it. And not just once. For tens of thousands of years, again and again, our ancestors kept their children alive through ice, famine, predators, and war. How? What did they know or do that made survival possible? This is the story of the hardest job in human history, raising a child at the edge of the world. It howls across the steppe, dragging knives of ice across the skin of a low, fur-lined shelter. Outside, the snow keeps falling thick, endless, and indifferent. But inside, in that cramped and flickering space, a drama older than fire itself is unfolding. A woman, knees drawn and body slick with sweat, grips a strip of leather between her teeth. Her breath comes in ragged gasps. Blood pools beneath her. And gathered close, other women, elder hands, sisters of the womb, whisper chants passed down through thousands of years. Not in words, in rhythm, in breath, in hope. This is not just a birth, it is a gamble with death. There are no scalpels here, no doctors, no sterile gloves. The only tools are instinct, firelight, and memory. And yet this scene, raw, animal, sacred, is how every single one of us began. Long before we built cities or carved gods into stone, we came into the world through women who bled on cold earth and screamed into the void, hoping the child inside them would not be claimed by the dark. In the Ice Age, to be pregnant was to walk a cliff's edge. There were no guarantees, only probabilities. Some mothers would die, many bobbies would never breathe. The human pelvis, a compromise between bipedalism and big-brained infants, made labor long and dangerous. Evolution had bought us intelligence, but at a brutal cost. A birth canal that barely fit the life it was trying to push out. So women prepared, not with prenatal vitamins, but with stories. Old women, the survivors of many births, became keepers of ancestral knowledge. They knew which plants soothed pain, how to soften the cervix with heat and herbs. They remembered the positions that eased the baby's descent. And they carried in their bones the collective memory of what worked and what didn't. This wasn't science in the modern sense, but it was science in the oldest sense, a long experiment in staying alive, repeated again and again, generation after generation. When labor began, the clan responded. A mother wasn't left alone. Birth was a communal act woven into the fabric of life. Some groups built shelters just for birthing, low, domed structures insulated with hides and moss. Inside, the air was warmer, the light softer. These weren't sterile spaces. They were sacred ones, sanctuaries of pain and possibility, the entrance to life hidden from the storm. But no amount of ritual could guarantee a good outcome. Infant mortality was staggering. In some prehistoric populations, half of all children died before the age of 5, and the math of survival was cruel. To keep a population stable, each woman needed to bear multiple children and lose many along the way. That meant the average woman spent most of her life either pregnant, breastfeeding, or recovering. Her body became both shelter and battlefield. Consider what that meant in practical terms. Each pregnancy demanded calories, warmth, protection, but food was scarce. Ice Age Europe was a land of megafauna and scarcity, a world where a missed hunt could mean starvation. And yet, through all this, women bore life. They carried it across frozen plains. They fed it from their bodies. They protected it against the wind, the wolves, and even their own weakened strength. And when the child was finally born, if it was born, the real work began. The first breath was a test. Could the lungs inflate? Was there crying? A silent newborn was a terrible omen. Some bobbies, blue with cold or weak from birth trauma, never opened their eyes. Others lived only hours. But if the child cried loud and clear, it was cause for celebration. Not joy, not yet, but hope. And in the Ice Age, hope was everything. There were no names yet. Those came later if the baby survived the first days. In some cultures, even in recent history, infants weren't named until they'd proven they would live. The risk of bonding too soon, of loving something that might be gone by morning, was too great. But even so, love crept in. As the mother pressed the newborn against her chest, skin to skin, something ancient awakened. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, flooded her brain. Her trembling fingers traced the soft line of the skull. She smelled her child not just with her nose, but with a part of her nervous system that felt every signal like lightning. This was not logic. This was biology, wild, primal, and sacred. In that moment, a new relationship began, one of complete dependence. The baby couldn't walk, speak, or feed itself. It couldn't regulate its own temperature. It was, in evolutionary terms, astonishingly helpless. And that helplessness, that was the miracle. Because it forced humans to do something no other species did as deeply: care. We weren't the fastest, strongest, or fiercest creatures on the Ice Age plains, but we were the ones who stayed up through the night for a crying infant, who held the sick, fed the weak, and made room for those who couldn't yet contribute. This wasn't just compassion, it was strategy. The clan that protected its young survived. The one that didn't vanished. And so, through every drop of blood, every scream, every fragile heartbeat, humanity continued. Not in stone tools, not in cave paintings, but in cradles made of skin and bone, in arms that never stopped holding, in mothers who walked barefoot across snowdrifts, one hand on their swollen belly, the other clenching a spear, determined to live long enough to meet the child they carried. The Ice Age was not a place that welcomed life. It was a test, brutal, constant, and absolute. And yet in that frozen world, life kept arriving. Small, pink, wailing, and always the fire was kept burning. In the next chapter, we follow what happens after that first breath, when the mother's body is broken, the baby is hungry, and the storm outside hasn't passed. Because survival didn't end at birth. It was only the beginning. And to raise a child in the Ice Age, it took a village. One child, one mother, but dozens of lives on the line. In the Ice Age, no one survived alone, especially not a newborn. From the moment a baby gasped its first breath, it was more than a private miracle. It was a collective responsibility. A tiny, squirming ember of life that had to be kept burning, not just by the mother, but by everyone who shared the fire. The idea of the nuclear family is a modern fiction. For most of our species' history, family was fluid. It wasn't a pair. It was a web: cousins, aunts, elders, neighbors, even unrelated women who had suckled their own children and still had milk to give. This system had a name, though the people living it never spoke it aloud: cooperative breeding. In biological terms, Homo sapiens are one of the few species on Earth where individuals willingly invest in raising children who aren't their own. In emotional terms, it meant that survival was stitched together with love that stretched beyond blood. Anthropologists call these helpers alloparents, the others who parent, and they weren't optional. A Paleolithic mother, especially after birth, was exhausted, cold, and calorie-starved. Her body had to recover. Her arms couldn't always hold. Her milk supply, dependent on food, rest, and hormones, could falter. So others stepped in. Grandmothers were especially vital. In fact, one of the most striking evolutionary theories, the grandmother hypothesis, argues that human lifespans became unusually long not so women could have more children, but so they could help raise their grandchildren. Older women, no longer bearing children themselves, became the stabilizers of the tribe, watching over the young, passing down knowledge, and becoming the thread that bound generations. Fathers, too, had their role, though not always as solitary providers. In Ice Age communities, the lines between gender responsibilities were porous. Yes, men hunted, but they also gathered, cooked, defended, played. Some may have carried infants wrapped in fur slings across miles of tundra. Others watched over toddlers as mothers gathered roots. And young siblings, children barely out of infancy themselves, became caretakers in training. A 5-year-old might be tasked with calming a crying baby, or keeping a crawling toddler from wandering into fire. These were not small acts. In a world where wolves lurked just beyond the tree line and starvation was always one bad winter away, distraction could mean death. But instead of viewing children as burdens, they were folded into the rhythm of life. Bobbies weren't sidelined. They were carried on backs, at hips, against chests, woven into daily movement like breath itself. Imagine the scene. A woman walks across a frosted plain, her hair matted with smoke, her muscles stiff from sleep on stone. She kneels to dig roots with a sharpened bone tool. At her side, a toddler mimics her, stabbing at the soil. A baby stirs against her back, wrapped tight in hide. Nearby, an elder hums softly, bouncing a fretful infant in her arms. This is not a daycare. This is life. And woven through that life, emotion. We often assume that ancient people were hardened, stoic, emotionally flat. But biology tells another story. A baby's cry is not just sound. It's engineered to pierce the adult brain like an arrow. It triggers cortisol, raises heart rates, floods caregivers with urgency. It is, in a very real way, an evolutionary alarm. And when that cry is soothed, when the infant is rocked, fed, or held close, another wave hits. Dopamine, oxytocin, the warm bath of bonding. This neurochemical loop doesn't care whose child it is. It just knows the sound means do something. That's how communities survived, not through intellect alone, but through compassion baked into the brain. Play, too, had a place. Once a child passed the danger window of infancy, they began to explore. And when they did, the entire clan became their playground. Elders taught games that mimicked real survival skills, throwing stones, balancing on logs, tracking footprints in snow. These weren't just diversions, they were rehearsal. Every laugh was a lesson, every chase a fragment of future knowledge. Artifacts whisper clues of these early bonds, tiny footprints preserved in ancient mud, side by side with larger ones. Clay figurines shaped like animals, worn smooth by little hands. Cave paintings with child-sized handprints, a silent signature left by someone who couldn't yet speak. These aren't just marks. They're messages. I was here. I mattered. Someone cared enough to let me leave my trace. And while every hand helped, the reality was still precarious. Illness could sweep through a camp in days. A sudden predator attack could end a childhood before it began. In those moments, the emotional cost rippled outward. The death of a baby wasn't just a private sorrow. It was a wound shared by the entire group. But so was joy. The first smile. The first step. The first time a child mimicked a hunting pose or said a word that made the elders laugh. These were milestones not just for the mother, but for everyone who kept that child alive long enough to reach them. In this web of shared survival, something remarkable happened. Humanity stopped being a collection of individuals and became something more, a species defined by interdependence. We evolved not just bigger brains, but bigger hearts. We learned that the survival of my child depended on your help. And in that mutuality, civilization was born, not in cities or empires, but in small camps, around flickering fires, with bobbies strapped to backs and toddlers curled beside elders. This is why we survived when so many others didn't. Neanderthals were strong, Denisovans were adaptable, but Homo sapiens, we were connected, wired for empathy, built for cooperation. And at the center of that system were the children, the ones who couldn't walk yet, couldn't hunt, couldn't contribute, and yet were treated as sacred. Because they were sacred, every baby was a promise, every child a prayer in flesh. In the next chapter, we confront the next impossible task, feeding that promise. Because keeping a baby alive wasn't just about love. It was about nourishment, about getting enough fat, warmth, and milk into a fragile body before the cold claimed it. We go deeper into the hunger that haunted every cradle, and the ways prehistoric families fought to keep their children fed in a world that offered no forgiveness. The fire burns low. Outside, the wind gnaws at the hide walls of the shelter like a starving wolf. Inside, a baby whimpers, small, pink, trembling with hunger. The mother lifts the child to her breast, her hands shaking not from the cold but from exhaustion. Her body is thin. Her milk has slowed. She hasn't eaten in 2 days, and yet she must feed. Because in the Ice Age, calories weren't just energy. They were survival measured by the mouthful. Feeding an adult was hard enough. Feeding an infant was an act of continuous improvisation, teetering between biology and desperation. A newborn couldn't chew, couldn't be weaned, couldn't digest meat, the very substance their clan bled and hunted for. Their only sustenance had to come from the mother through milk, and only milk for months. But a mother's ability to produce that milk depended on what she ate and how often she ate it. This is where the miracle begins, and where the nightmare lurks. Breastfeeding in Paleolithic societies wasn't a matter of months, but years. Many Ice Age children nursed until the age of 3 or 4. This wasn't sentimentality. It was necessity. Human milk was the safest, most reliable source of nutrition in an unpredictable environment. It was warm, portable, clean. It carried antibodies that shielded the child from infection. And for the first many months of life, it was often the only thing standing between a baby and death. But sustaining that milk was no small feat. The mother had to eat not just enough for herself, but for the growing child, siphoning nutrients from her body. In lean seasons, when meat was scarce or roots frozen beneath the ground, her milk could thin. Some mothers turned to the support of other women, wet nurses in all but name. An aunt, a cousin, an older sister who had recently given birth and could offer a few precious mouthfuls. This web of shared sustenance was one more thread in the net of alloparental care. Eventually, though, the day came when milk was no longer enough. Weaning was a tightrope walk. Too soon and the baby might choke or fall ill. Too late and the mother's already overworked body could break. So the clan introduced solids slowly, carefully, and with whatever the land allowed. Forget gerber. The Ice Age pantry was raw, elemental, and brutally honest. One of the earliest foods may have been bone marrow, the soft, fatty core of long bones from mammoths, bison, or reindeer. It was rich in calories and easy to mash. Mothers would crack open bones with stone tools, scoop out the contents, and feed it warm to their children, a kind of primal baby food. In some burials, archaeologists have found tiny bones with signs of being split, possibly to extract marrow for infant diets. Alongside marrow came mashed roots, ground tubers, and occasionally chewed up food pre-digested by adults and spat into the child's mouth, a method still practiced by some traditional societies today. It wasn't aesthetic, it wasn't sterile, but it worked. And then animal fat rendered from hunted prey, smeared on gums, mixed with crushed nuts or dried berries when available. Fat was more than flavor. It was insulation from within. In infants, it supported brain growth, regulated body temperature, and served as a slow-burning energy reserve. A fat-fed baby was a warm baby. A warm baby was a living one. But these early diets came with danger. Malnutrition wasn't just about not eating. It was about eating the wrong thing at the wrong time. Some children developed scurvy, rickets, or anemia long before anyone knew the names. Isotopic analysis of prehistoric baby bones reveals startling truth: stunted growth, delayed dental eruption, signs of nutrient deficiency etched into the enamel like scars. The bones remember what the bobbies cannot. And yet, in the teeth of those same skeletons, scientists have also found signs of care, evidence of extended breastfeeding, consistent caloric intake, and even periods of recovery after starvation. These weren't neglected children. They were loved, fed when possible, protected fiercely. And when they grew strong enough to chew, they were slowly welcomed into the full diet of the tribe: cooked meats, dried berries, boiled tubers, and whatever else the land, sea, or sky would offer. Every bite was hard-won. Meat meant hunting, sometimes weeks of tracking a single animal, only to fail. Berries meant knowing which ones weren't poisonous. Roots meant digging with fingers gone numb. And yet the group always saved some for the child. Not out of pity, but priority. Because every baby that survived meant the bloodline would continue. But there's a deeper truth here, hidden beneath the hunger. Feeding a child was never just about calories. It was about connection. The act of sharing food from breast to marrow to chewable meat bound the child to the clan. It said, "You belong. We will not let you starve." And that bond wasn't broken easily. Even when supplies ran low, even when the winter dragged on past the point of hope, adults might go hungry so that the youngest could eat. It was an economy of sacrifice, and its currency was love. In the end, the Ice Age didn't just forge stronger bodies. It forged stronger bonds between mother and child, between siblings and elders, between hunger and hope. And so the child grew. Teeth emerged, jaws strengthened. The baby who once fed only at the breast now gnawed on cooked sinew and licked grease from a cracked bowl. The clan watched, laughed, encouraged. Another milestone, another sign that the fire of life still burned strong. But the cold had not relented. Keeping that small, growing body warm was the next great challenge. Because feeding the flame wasn't enough, you had to shield it from the wind. In the next chapter, we step into that struggle. How did Ice Age humans protect their fragile children from the most relentless killer of all, the cold? The answer lies not in tools or shelters, but in the warmth of skin, fur, and firelight. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable in the Ice Age, it was an executioner. Silent, patient, unrelenting. For a baby, warmth was everything. Their bodies lost heat 5 times faster than an adult's. Their fat stores were thin, their skin too new. One night of exposed skin could end a life before it had even begun. And yet, somehow, against all odds, in a world of snow and wind and bone-splintering chill, they survived. But they didn't survive alone. When we picture Paleolithic life, we often imagine hard men and harsher women, battling mammoths and sharpening spears. What we forget are the quiet hours, the long, bitter nights when survival meant not movement but stillness. When it meant wrapping your body around another, giving up your own heat to keep someone else alive. This is the hidden history of parenting. The war against cold waged not with weapons but with warmth. There were no baby blankets, no cribs, no thermometers, but Ice Age humans were nothing if not adaptive. They learned fast through trial, through tragedy, that keeping a baby alive meant keeping them warm, constantly, closely. First came the fur. Animal hides were more than clothing. They were insulation, layered with fat, sinew, and instinct. Reindeer hides in particular were prized for their density and softness. Infants were swaddled in them, often lined with dried moss or feathers to add an extra layer of cushion and absorb any waste. This wasn't just comfort, it was engineering. The feather-lined fur cradle worked like a natural thermos, trapping body heat and shielding the baby from outside chill. Then came body heat, the original fire. Mothers kept their bobbies tucked against bare skin under layers of hide, their chests becoming both cradle and furnace. This close contact wasn't only about temperature. It regulated breathing, heartbeat, and even sleep cycles. Today, we call it kangaroo care. Back then, it was just called staying alive. And they didn't do it alone. Fathers, siblings, grandparents, the whole clan contributed to warmth. Families would pile into shared sleeping spaces, often around a central fire, wrapping themselves around the most vulnerable members. Bobbies weren't pushed to the side. They were placed in the center, a living ember to be protected from the freeze. Archaeological digs have uncovered ancient hearths surrounded by smoke-blackened cave walls, their ceilings stained with soot from fires that burned, night after night, for thousands of years. Some of those hearths still hold the impressions of sleeping bodies in the ash, and in some, the smallest prints belong to infants. It was a sacred geometry of sleep. The fire in the middle, the baby close to the flame, and the bodies around both. A constellation of warmth, love, and exhaustion. Sometimes bobbies were even carried throughout the day in primitive slings made of tanned leather or animal gut. Tied across the chest or back, these slings kept the baby close, swaying with the rhythm of the parent's gait, protected by the adult's body heat and the thick wrap of fur. It was warmth in motion, a traveling womb. But even this wasn't always enough. In colder climates or high-altitude regions, the risk of hypothermia remained constant. So Ice Age parents turned to nesting. Some burial sites of infants tell this part of the story. In Russia's Sungir site, a child's grave revealed a bed lined with fox teeth, ivory beads, and layers of fur, not ceremonial but practical. A death shrouded in warmth, as if the living had tried to give the child one last shield against the cold. In another site in France, tiny bones were found nestled in a pocket of goose feathers and moss, carefully arranged, not scattered. Someone had taken the time to gather soft things. Someone had tried. And it wasn't just during sleep. The cold stalked the day as well. Wind could strip heat from the body in minutes. Infants were often kept in small, hide-lined nests within the shelter while adults hunted or gathered. When the group moved, bobbies were the last to be exposed, bundled quickly, carried carefully, sometimes not even allowed to cry in open terrain for fear that a predator would hear. But the most remarkable warmth was the emotional one. Think of a mother, teeth chattering, her own hands numb, rocking a swaddled baby through the night. Not because she's awake from anxiety, but because she knows if she sleeps too deeply, her baby might stop breathing. She listens for that tiny inhale, that pause, that restart, over and over for hours. That vigilance, that primal, ferocious care was the quiet heartbeat of survival. Love in the Ice Age was not soft. It was not poetic. It was hard, cold, cracked-fingered, and sore-backed. It was staying awake when your bones screamed for rest. It was sharing the last strip of fur. It was feeding a baby while your own stomach begged. Love was endurance. And endurance saved the human species. Even today, researchers studying ancient DNA and child burials marvel at how many bobbies survived, how many made it to toddlerhood, even in the deadliest environments on Earth. We weren't the fastest species or the strongest, but we were the warmest, and in that warmth we found resilience. The Ice Age wanted to freeze the next generation in its cradle. Our ancestors fought back not with spears, but with skin, fire, and fierce tenderness. And so the child lived, fed, cradled, warmed. Day by day they grew. But surviving the cold was only half the battle. What came next was just as crucial: the battle for safety, for vigilance, for protection in a world that never stopped hunting. Because fire can't guard against fangs. In the next chapter, we step into the shadows to explore how prehistoric families kept their bobbies safe from predators, violence, and nature's cruel indifference. This is the story of guardianship, of watching eyes in the night, and the courage to defend what could not yet defend itself. Before a child could speak, it listened. Before it knew fire or danger or even its own name, it heard the world, the breath of the wind through the cave mouth, the crackle of the hearth, the muffled thump of footfall on packed earth. But most of all, it heard a voice unlike any other, soft, lilting, carved in warmth, a mother's voice. In the cold expanse of the Ice Age, survival was tactile: food, shelter, heat. But language was the invisible shelter. It held bobbies long before their arms could. When we imagine Paleolithic parenting, we often focus on the physical: feeding, wrapping, carrying. But there was another form of nourishment, just as essential: sound. Communication. The rhythmic coo, the hum of a lullaby, the soothing repetition of vowel-rich syllables spoken low against an infant's ear. Scientists today call it motherese, the universal pattern of high-pitched, exaggerated speech that caregivers instinctively use with bobbies. It slows language down, makes it clearer, more musical. It's found across cultures, from modern nurseries to remote Amazonian tribes. And while it feels modern, its roots are ancient, older than writing, older than words. Long before grammar, long before syntax, there was tone, there was rhythm, there was melody. These were the first bridges between parent and child, acoustic lifelines in a silent world. In the Ice Age, when a baby cried, it wasn't just distress. It was a broadcast. Predators could hear it. Soothing the baby was more than comfort, it was protection. That soft coo wasn't sentimental, it was strategic. And over time, those coos became codified, repeated, shaped by breath and need. Eventually, they became early language. Some anthropologists believe that human language didn't begin with tool-making or hunting strategy, but with bobbies, with mothers needing to calm, guide, and bond with infants too fragile to follow but too precious to lose. In this view, parenting wasn't just a biological function, it was an evolutionary engine. The sounds we now call speech were forged not in the mouths of hunters, but in the cradles of fire-lit caves. And then there were the songs. Imagine it, a mother rocking her child, the cave around her dark but pulsing with embers. Outside, wolves howl. The wind moves like a ghost, but inside she sings low, wordless, a tune passed down from mother to daughter for generations. The song has no name, no lyrics, but it has shape, and that shape is comfort. These weren't performances, they were tools. Singing helped regulate the baby's breathing, lowered stress, even boosted immunity. Modern studies show that lullabies increase infant oxytocin levels, the hormone of bonding. In the Ice Age, this chemical thread may have been one of the first anchors of love. A lullaby was a promise. You are safe. You are not alone. And bobbies didn't just listen. They responded. They watched lips move. They mirrored expressions. They mimicked sounds. Long before their first spoken word, they had already rehearsed thousands. Their minds were primed not just to hear, but to imitate. Language wasn't downloaded. It was danced, a back-and-forth exchange of breath and tone and timing. In the flicker of torchlight, parents played this game of mimicry. A smile, a tongue stuck out, a syllable stretched wide. And when the baby responded, when their own lips twitched in return, it wasn't just adorable. It was the spark of cognition, proof that something inside was lighting up. And that light needed fuel. Which brings us to the objects. Among the flint tools and mammoth bones left behind in caves and shelters, archaeologists have found stranger things. Small carved figurines, smoothed stones shaped like animals, bits of antler polished to a shine. Some call them idols. Others see ritual. But another theory lingers, quieter, simpler, maybe they were toys. Not toys in the modern sense, but objects designed to be touched, explored, mouthed. A fox carved from ivory small enough for a toddler's hand. A stone ball polished smooth by a child's fingers. These weren't just ornaments. They were catalysts for curiosity, for neural development, for the early scaffolding of thought. We know that play is not trivial in early childhood. It's how brains grow, how motor skills refine, how risk and reward begin to take shape. Even today, bobbies reach for faces, for shiny things, for the unknown. Ice Age bobbies were no different. Their world was harsh, but their minds were hungry. A carved antler in the hand of a child wasn't just art. It was a tool for growth. Parents, especially mothers, likely guided these early interactions. They handed over stones, gestured, made sounds to match the object. A snort for the bison, a trill for the bird. It was not yet language, but it was learning. And the baby, wide-eyed and alert, soaked it in. In this delicate theater of sound and object and gaze, the roots of human culture took hold. We were building more than shelters. We were building minds. And perhaps that's what makes us uniquely human. Not our tools, not even our fire, but the way we talk to our bobbies. The way we sing to them, not just to lull them to sleep, but to pull them into the world. To say in song and in coo and in whispered syllables, "You are here, you are loved, you belong." In the end, this chapter isn't about words, it's about connection. The invisible thread that ran from parent to child, voice to ear, heart to mind. In a world of predators and cold and hunger, it was the softest things, a lullaby, a carved toy, a smiling face, that built the strongest bonds. And those bonds would carry the child through the next great challenge. Learning to move, to stumble, to walk in a world made of stone and ice. In the next chapter, we follow the first steps, not just physical, but emotional, as Ice Age children begin to leave the cradle behind and take their first unsteady strides into a world that demanded everything. There was no home address in the Ice Age, no fixed hearth, no guaranteed return. Home was wherever the fire still smoked in the morning, and wherever the game still ran in the distance. And so the clan moved. They moved across frozen riverbeds and windswept valleys. They followed the great herds of reindeer, the seasonal migration of mammoth and elk. They crossed jagged passes, thin ice, deep forests, always chasing warmth, food, safety. Movement was not a choice. It was survival. But moving with a baby, that was something else entirely. A newborn is a miracle of fragility. Soft skull, soft spine, helpless limbs. It cannot walk, cannot speak, cannot feed itself. And yet it had to go with the clan across miles of hostile terrain, where one misstep could be the difference between life and loss. So they adapted. Infants were not carried in arms, not for long. A mother walking 10, 15 miles a day across uneven ground could not afford to keep both hands occupied. Instead, she wrapped her child against her body. Animal hides became slings. Gut-stitched carriers strapped the baby to her chest or back, bound in fur and lined with moss to keep out the cold and absorb waste. The baby's ear pressed against her heartbeat. The motion soothed it. The scent kept it calm. This was the Ice Age stroller, a traveling womb swaying with the rhythm of survival. And yet the rhythm was never smooth. Imagine the terrain: mud that sucked at ankles, ice that cracked underfoot, hills that turned to knife-edged rock. In this world, a misstep meant not a twisted ankle but an orphaned child. So the clan moved differently when bobbies were with them. They moved slower, more cautiously. They chose routes not just for hunting but for safety. They followed paths with cover from wind, access to water, and enough space to circle into defensive positions if needed. Children changed everything, and the clan accepted that. Bobbies weren't burdens. They were investments, fragile, yes, but sacred. The clan knew that each infant was a spark in the long fire of human continuity. If the baby died, the future dimmed. So they built their migrations around them. The pace of the hunt bent to the needs of the smallest. Shelters were another adaptation. Some groups used natural caves, but when those weren't available, they built. Mammoth bones, stacked and arched, formed the skeletal frames of portable homes. Hides were stretched over the structure, weighed down with stones or mud to seal in warmth. Inside, infants were placed in nests of moss, feathers, and fur, close to the hearth or to another human body. These shelters weren't random. They had a logic, a layout. Entrances faced away from the wind. Fire pits were dug in the center to reduce smoke and keep heat close. Sleeping areas clustered around the fire in a radial pattern, the smallest bodies tucked in tight, wrapped in layers of hide, watched constantly. Even the camp's perimeter had silent rules. Sharp tools were kept out of reach. Embers were banked when not in use. Older children were taught early to carry water, feed fires, or rock their younger siblings, not as chores, but as ritual. Every person played a role in keeping the infant alive. But there were no guarantees. Exposure was a constant threat. The sun could burn just as the snow could kill. A sudden storm could send the temperature plunging, and bobbies, with their undeveloped thermoregulation, were the first to suffer. More than one infant was lost to a single cold night, wrapped in furs but still not enough. There were falls, too, ice hidden under moss, slopes that gave way. Mothers learned to walk with a lower center of gravity to balance their weight against the pull of the sling. The danger never stopped. And there were predators. A crying baby could summon death from miles away. Wolves, hyenas, cave lions all knew the sound of vulnerability. That's why many Ice Age clans developed protocols for movement. Scouts traveled ahead. The group stayed close. And when one person rested, another watched. Infants were hushed with food, rocked constantly, never left alone, not even for a moment. Sometimes a baby would die anyway, and the clan would stop. Not forever, but long enough to mark the loss. Burial sites show careful interments, beads, ochre, tiny tools placed beside tiny bones. Even in death, the child was held. But for every infant lost, another survived, and their presence transformed the clan in quieter ways. They brought laughter, play, even hope. Their needs forced the adults to rest, to pause the chase, to sit still and be gentle. In those moments, beneath the vast gray sky, something profoundly human emerged: patience, tenderness, love stretched across miles. When the clan moved, it moved like a single body, heart in the center, limbs on the edges. And at the very core, often too small to see, was a child. They weren't passengers, they were the reason. And as the baby grew, as it began to crawl, then stand, then stumble forward on uncertain feet, it learned the rhythm of motion. The path beneath its feet wasn't foreign, it was familiar. This was how life worked, always onward, always together. Because survival didn't happen in place, it happened in motion. In the next chapter, we watch what happens when those first steps become full-blown curiosity, when toddlers become explorers, and the Ice Age itself becomes their playground. Because a child who survived didn't just rest, it began to learn. There was no graduation, no chalkboard, no desk, no teacher calling names. And yet, the Ice Age child learned more before their 10th birthday than most of us will in a lifetime. Because in this world, ignorance wasn't just inconvenient, it was fatal. The moment a child could walk, they became an apprentice to life. At first, it was just following, mimicry, a toddler waddling after its mother, stepping in her footprints in the snow, watching how she foraged for roots without touching the poisonous ones, watching how she checked under rocks for grubs, or how she sniffed just slightly before taking a bite of a strange fruit. These weren't formal lessons, but they were lessons all the same. Learning in the Ice Age didn't come from words. It came from observation, repetition, consequence. A hand stretched toward a fire too quickly got burned. A child who wandered too far felt the hard edge of panic, or worse. There were no fences. The edge of safety was the edge of sight. You stayed close to the fire, or you disappeared into the night. And yet, this world was rich with education. When anthropologists study Paleolithic sites, they find traces of small hands carved into cave walls, outlines blown in ochre, fingers splayed like starbursts. Some are so low to the ground, so faint, they could only have been made by children. It wasn't just the adults painting mammoths and hunt scenes. It was children too, imitating, practicing, being included. And this mattered. Inclusion wasn't a luxury, it was survival training. A toddler might start with small tasks, fetching sticks for kindling, tossing bones into fire pits, watching the older siblings flake stones into tools. But as they grew, so did their responsibilities. By 5 or 6, a child might already be sharpening small blades, stripping sinew, helping stretch hide. Not play acting, doing. Archaeologists have found child-sized spear points, tiny scrapers with edges dulled by use. These weren't toys. They were training wheels for reality. A child needed to know how to clean a wound, how to bind a foot with hide, how to identify tracks not one day but today, because tomorrow wasn't promised. And learning didn't stop at the practical. There was emotional instruction, too. Around the fire, elders shared stories, myths, warnings, histories etched in memory long before writing. A child learned what happened to the one who strayed during a hunt, or the boy who challenged the lion alone. Stories weren't entertainment. They were memory's armor, and they wrapped children in layers of wisdom bought by blood. Sometimes the lessons left marks. There are bones, femurs, tibias showing stress fractures and healing patterns in children as young as 6. Not abuse, use. Kids running, climbing, falling, practicing. There is evidence of repetitive motion in shoulder joints from throwing stones or spears over and over. Childhood in the Ice Age wasn't easy, but it was active, purposeful, and full of transformation. And in the quietest moments, the most sacred lessons passed down, not in words but in gestures. A father sits beside his daughter. Between them, a pile of dry moss and splinters. His hands cracked, thickened by years of survival, show her how to hold the fire drill, how to press, how to spin. Not too fast, not too slow, she mimics. The ember sparks. Her eyes widen. For the first time, she has made warmth from nothing, from effort, from friction. It is not just fire, it is independence. This was how the clan extended itself through time. Not through monuments or books, but through living memory passed hand to hand. Each generation shaping the next not with control, but with care. Survival wasn't just taught, it was entrusted. And everyone was a teacher. Older siblings taught younger ones how to climb a tree to scout for danger. Aunts showed nieces how to braid sinew for bowstrings. Uncles showed nephews how to track scat or test the thickness of ice. Even the infirm, too old to hunt, became instructors. Their failures became case studies. Their successes became sacred. What we often call instinct was, in fact, education passed through bodies, through repetition, through play that mirrored reality. A boy throwing pebbles at a rabbit wasn't just playing, he was learning aim, speed, silence. A girl stacking bones wasn't wasting time, she was training her hands for structure, for traps, for tools. Play was preparation. And through it, something remarkable happened. Children didn't just survive, they innovated. Some of the earliest signs of tool experimentation appear in places where children once lived. Slight modifications to scraper shapes, new bindings on composite tools, tiny tweaks born not of protocol but of curiosity. Children didn't inherit knowledge passively. They tested it, pushed it, and sometimes they made it better. Because that's what human childhood is for. We are one of the only species on Earth with such an extended juvenile period. Years, decades of learning before full independence. That time isn't a delay, it's a design. Nature made us slow to mature so we could absorb more, so we could become not just survivors but inventors, thinkers, storytellers. By the age of 10, an Ice Age child had mastered more real-world skills than most adults do today. They could butcher, track, weave, signal, heal, and navigate. They knew how to read wind by the bend of grass, how to hear the footfall of danger in the hush before birds scattered. They were students of silence and motion. And when the day came that they picked up their first real spear, not a toy, but a tool, they were ready. Not because they had been told what to do, but because someone had shown them. because the clan had made space for them to fail, to try, to repeat, until instinct and knowledge became indistinguishable. In the next chapter, we step deeper into the lives of these Ice Age children, not just how they learned to live, but how they learned to belong. Because after survival comes identity, and childhood was only the beginning of becoming human. The Ice Age never asked for permission, it simply took. A stumble in the cold, a cough that never faded, a night too long without food, and another child was gone. For all the ingenuity, love, and vigilance poured into raising them, most Ice Age children never reached adulthood. Some never even saw their first winter. And yet they were loved deeply. This chapter doesn't follow the ones who survived. It follows the ones who didn't. The smallest footprints, the graves tucked into the walls of caves, the whispers of sorrow that still echo, faint but unbroken, across tens of thousands of years. We begin in Austria, near the banks of the Danube, in a cave called Kremswachtberg. Here, archaeologists found a double infant burial dated to around 31,000 years ago. Two bobbies placed side by side, heads touching. They had been swaddled in mammoth ivory beads, nearly 3,000 of them, sewn into tiny garments that have long since decayed. A third infant buried nearby was laid beneath a slab of red ochre, a pigment used in ritual. Their bones were fragile. Their lives even more so. But someone had grieved for them. Someone had taken the time to dress their tiny bodies, decorate their resting place, and say goodbye. This was not the disposal of flesh. It was the farewell of family. There is no doubt anymore. Ice Age people mourned. And not just for the old, the fallen hunters, the elders who passed in their sleep. They mourned their bobbies, even when losing a baby was common, even when death was a rhythm as predictable as sunrise. Some scientists once assumed prehistoric parents couldn't have bonded deeply with their children. That infant mortality was so high, they must have remained emotionally distant, guarded from grief. But the evidence tells a different story. It shows care. It shows ritual. It shows remembrance. In Russia, at the Sungir site, a boy around 12 years old was buried beside his sister, both covered in thousands of ivory beads, fox teeth, and carved spears. It would have taken hundreds of hours to craft these objects, thousands more to gather the materials. These weren't just bodies to bury. They were people worth honoring, children worth remembering. And then there are the even quieter signs. In northern Italy, remains were found of an infant with severe physical deformities, a rare cranial condition. The baby had clearly been sick, possibly since birth. And yet they lived for months. Someone had cared for them, held them, fed them, kept them warm day after day, knowing maybe that the end would come, but never stopping. Because love didn't wait for hope. Love just was. We think of grief as a modern emotion, something refined, human, poetic. But it is older than language, deeper than ceremony. It is the instinct to hold on even when nature says let go. And perhaps this pain is part of what made us human in the first place. Think of what loss demands. When a child dies, a parent must choose, collapse or continue. The Ice Age gave no time for despair. And yet, those who carried on did so not because they were numb, but because they remembered. The death of one child made the protection of others even more urgent. Grief, in its own cruel way, forged resilience, and it bound people together. When a baby was lost, the whole clan felt it. The mother, yes, but also the siblings, the cousins, the elders who had seen it before. Grief moved like fire through a group, consuming, yes, but also connecting. Mourning became a communal act and likely the seed of something larger, ritual. The first funerals may not have had words, but they had silence, touch, symbols: a shell placed beside a body, a red pigment brushed across skin, a stone laid gently over the heart. These gestures, repeated, became tradition, and tradition became culture. Loss, ironically, gave rise to meaning. Even today, we find graves of Ice Age infants surrounded by objects we don't fully understand: antlers, shells, smoothed stones. Were they toys, tools, talismans, or offerings from mothers and fathers trying with trembling hands to send something of themselves with the child into the unknown? We can only guess. But whatever their function, their message is clear: this child mattered. And perhaps that is what sets our species apart most of all. Not our intelligence, not our tools, but our refusal to forget the ones we lost. Grief made us gather closer, share more, protect more fiercely. It turned parents into guardians. It made fathers more watchful, siblings more tender, because everyone knew tomorrow it could be their turn. Loss was the quiet teacher behind every survival. It taught mothers to nurse longer, taught clans to stay closer to fire, taught fathers to carve better spears. Every fallen child became an unspoken vow: not again if we can help it. Grief, unbearable as it was, became an engine of evolution. Even our genes tell the story. Some of the hardest trials Ice Age humans endured: famine, infection, exposure, would have killed entire lineages if not for adaptation. The immune systems that evolved in those generations were forged in the crucible of infant death. The stress response in mothers' bodies, the timing of birth, even the structure of the pelvis, all were shaped by which children survived and which didn't. And behind each adaptation was a loss: a tiny body that didn't wake up, a name never spoken again. The graves remind us every survivor stood on a mountain of absences. And yet there is hope in that. Because we didn't turn away, we didn't abandon feeling. We kept loving, knowing the cost. We kept risking joy. We kept holding our bobbies close, even when the nights were long, even when the wolves howled, even when the odds were cruel. We chose love again and again. And that, perhaps, is the most ancient wisdom of all. In the next chapter, we follow what happened when that love had to stretch further, into belief, into ritual, into the great mystery that lay beyond death. Because to lose a child is to ask a question no fire can answer: where did they go? And so humans looked up into the stars and began to wonder. We often imagine evolution as a saga of hunters and warriors, survival earned by the spear, the chase, the kill. But the real story, the one etched in our bones and buried in our genes, began not in the hunt, but in the cradle. It began with a newborn, too fragile to walk, too helpless to feed itself, cradled in arms made strong not by combat but by care. Because the truth is, raising bobbies, not just birthing them, shaped what it meant to be human. Unlike most mammals, human infants are born ridiculously early. A baby horse can run within hours. A baby chimp can cling to its mother's fur and hold on tight. But a human newborn, it flails, it cries, it can't hold its own head up. This helplessness isn't a flaw, it's a trade-off, and a profound one. It starts with the pelvis. When our ancestors stood upright, their pelvises narrowed. But as brain size grew, something had to give. The solution: birth bobbies earlier, much earlier, before their heads grew too big to pass through. This is called the obstetric dilemma. The result was an evolutionary gamble, bobbies born underdeveloped, utterly dependent on others for years. But dependence isn't weakness. It's the engine of connection. That long stretch of helplessness, months, then years of feeding, soothing, carrying, protecting, created something rare in the animal world: extended childhood. And with it, extended parenting. Not just from mothers, but from fathers, siblings, grandparents, and clan members. This wasn't just practical, it was transformational. Because to raise a human child is to collaborate. To feed it, you need surplus. To guard it, you need trust. To teach it, you need time. And so our ancestors, from the cold steppes of Siberia to the caves of France, began to specialize. Some hunted, some gathered, some watched the fire, others held the bobbies. This division of labor became the heart of human society, and that heart began beating around the cradle. Even today, you can see the imprint of this ancient adaptation in our DNA. Studies show that human brains are uniquely wired for social awareness, facial recognition, emotional mirroring, language anticipation. Bobbies begin tracking eye contact within days of birth. They mimic expressions by the end of the first month. They don't just need food and warmth, they need connection. Because for humans, survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about staying together. This is where Homo sapiens began to outpace their Ice Age cousins. Neanderthals were strong, smart, adapted to the cold, but their infants, though similar to ours, may not have inspired the same kind of interdependent care systems. Their populations were smaller, their tools more rigid. Their burial sites show tenderness but fewer signs of group-wide investment in the young. Homo sapiens, by contrast, exploded with diversity in tools, in art, in cooperation. And much of it can be traced back to the social brain, the ability to read others, teach others, raise others. That ability doesn't start in adulthood, it starts in infancy. In fact, neuroscientists believe that the act of caring for infants rewired adult brains too. Oxytocin, the so-called love hormone, floods the body during bonding, increasing trust, empathy, even memory. Holding a baby, responding to its cries, interpreting its needs, these behaviors shaped not only the child but the caregiver. And over generations, those patterns became instincts. By the Ice Age, the human brain had ballooned to 3 times the size of our early hominin ancestors. But more important than size was plasticity. A human child's brain is like wet clay, shaped by every sound, touch, and moment of safety. This demanded immense input from the group, but it also allowed for something no other species achieved: cumulative culture. Each generation could pass on not just instincts, but innovations: how to build a spear, how to track a herd, how to tell a story. And that transmission began before a child could even speak, through lullabies, gestures, games. Evolution wasn't just about fittest bodies anymore. It was about most teachable minds. In this light, a baby wasn't a burden. It was an opportunity. Each child was a vessel for memory, skill, and the soul of a people. The more children survived, the more a culture could grow. And so evolution began favoring traits that helped babies live: not just strength, but tenderness; not just alertness, but patience; not just aggression, but love. It's no accident that the average human childhood now spans over a decade. That's a biological investment no predator would make. It only works if you can protect it, if your community can surround the child with enough care, safety, and learning to make it to adulthood. Which is why parenting isn't just a private act, it's a species strategy. And it's not done evolving. Today, we are still shaped by Ice Age parenting. Our school systems, our neighborhoods, our healthcare, all are echoes of the ancient logic that said, the survival of the child is the survival of us all. Even now, when we see a baby, something ancient stirs. We lower our voice. We soften our gaze. We instinctively coo. These are not modern quirks. They are prehistoric codes written in the language of survival, activated by a tiny face. It's easy to think of evolution as red in tooth and claw, but in truth, it's also soft in hand and voice. It sings lullabies, it warms cradles, it holds on and doesn't let go. The next time you see a child toddling through a room, pausing to smile, to mimic, to reach up, know that you're watching evolution at work. Not just in that child, but in you. Because we did not simply raise bobbies. Bobbies raised us. The wind howled across the frozen plain. The night was long, the stars sharp and cold. And somewhere beneath the shelter of a rock ledge, or inside a ring of mammoth bones, a mother pulled her child close, skin to skin, breath to breath. She didn't know the science of thermoregulation. She didn't know about oxytocin, or evolutionary psychology, or the precise carbon dating of the flint tool by her knee. She just knew the baby needed to live. She held that tiny body closer, as if her arms alone could fight back the Ice Age. And somehow they did. This entire story, our survival, our rise, our ability to shape the world, began with moments like that. A fire flickering low, a child not yet weaned, and a parent trembling, sleepless, afraid, refusing to let go. For tens of thousands of years, that scene repeated across continents. From the windswept steppes of Eurasia to the wooded caves of France to the cold river valleys of the Americas. Different clans, different tools, but always the same fire, the same fear, the same love. Because parenting in the Paleolithic was not a gentle thing. It was brutal, it was relentless, and it was holy. There were no warm beds, no antibiotics, no guarantees, just risk in every cough, every cold snap, every stumble too close to a cliff's edge. Infants died often, mothers even more. But still they tried. Again and again, they brought life into a world that seemed designed to crush it. Why? Because somewhere deep in our marrow, even before we had gods or names, we believed that the child mattered. That even in a world of predators and hunger and cold, this tiny being was worth everything. It was the most human thing we ever did. We didn't outlast the mammoths because we were stronger. We didn't outlive the Neanderthals because we were smarter. We survived because we protected the fragile. We built cultures not on conquest but on care. We surrounded our weakest with warmth, food, story, safety, and song. That's the secret. That's the legacy. When archaeologists unearth Ice Age graves, the ones with infants buried in swaddles of beads, ochre, and antler spoons, they're not just finding bones. They're finding love, a kind of grief you don't waste on the replaceable, a kind of ritual you only make for someone who mattered deeply. They're finding proof that we have always been this way. That the lullabies, the cradles, the bedtime stories, they didn't start in nurseries. They started beside the fire, under stars that froze your breath mid-sentence. When a father sang low to keep the wolves away. When a sibling passed a mouthful of marrow to a crying baby. When a grandmother placed feathers in a nest of moss, whispering something no language could yet record. And if you listen, you can still hear it, the ancient music of protection, the heartbeat of the first families. Today, we swaddle our children in cotton instead of fur. We heat our homes with wires instead of flame. But the rhythm is the same. The sleepless nights, the fear when they're sick, the irrational, overwhelming love. None of it changed. Because Ice Age parenting didn't just get us through the cold, it built the warmth we carry now. The compassion, the gentleness, the endurance, the fire. And it still burns, not in a hearth of stone, but in every bedtime kiss, every bottle fed at 3 a.m., every soft song hummed when the lights are out and the world feels too big. Every time we choose the child over convenience, the future over the now. That is our inheritance, not the tools, not the spears, not the cave art. The care, the desperate, determined, transcendent care that brought us out of the dark. So if you've ever held a crying baby and felt that ache in your chest, if you've ever stood at a crib and whispered, "Please stay alive," you are speaking the oldest prayer we know, spoken by mothers with frostbitten hands, by fathers dragging wood through snow, by entire clans that moved mountains just to let a baby sleep one more night. You are part of a chain that stretches back farther than memory. You are holding the fire. And as long as we do that, as long as we choose to love the smallest among us, to carry them when they can't walk, to feed them when we are starving, to sing even when the wolves are howling, we will survive anything. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about bobbies in the Ice Age. It's the story of why we're still here. The Ice Age tried to freeze us out, tried to scatter us to wind and glacier, but it couldn't extinguish what mattered most. We kept each other warm, and in every cradle, in every lullaby, in every bedtime story whispered through tired lips, the fire still burns.